For 10 years, the number was 0. Every geneticist, every textbook said the same thing. African populations carry 0 Neanderthal DNA. Not almost none. 0. In 2020, a team at Princeton pulled every available African genome and ran it through a new method called IBDmix, built to catch exactly this signal without needing an outside sample to compare against. The 0 didn't hold. Not in one population. Not in 10. In every single African population they tested, Neanderthal DNA showed up. This isn't a story about Neanderthals and Africans ever meeting face-to-face. It's about a population that already carried Neanderthal DNA walking back into Africa, long after everyone assumed that door had closed. The decade-old assumption that shaped how scientists talked about human ancestry was simply wrong, and almost nobody outside the field noticed the correction. Here's how a 0 became a global rewrite, and where that Neanderthal DNA came from. The 0 wasn't a guess pulled out of thin air. It was built from something that looked on paper like solid evidence. Nobody had ever pulled a Neanderthal fossil out of African soil. Every Neanderthal skeleton, every scrap of ancient Neanderthal DNA scientists could physically hold in a lab, came from sites in Europe or Western Asia. Not one came from anywhere on the African continent, despite decades of digging across multiple countries by multiple research teams. Neanderthals were classified geographically as a European and Western Asian population, full stop, and that classification itself became part of the evidence, so the logic looked airtight, almost too clean to argue with in a lecture hall. If Neanderthals never lived in Africa, and the modern humans who stayed in Africa never left, the two groups simply never crossed paths on African soil, with no shared territory and no interbreeding to leave a genetic signal behind. That gap in the fossil record became the foundation for a rule taught in genetics courses for a decade straight, repeated in lecture halls, popular articles, and ancestry test marketing without much pushback. Outside Africa, expect a small, measurable dose of Neanderthal ancestry. Inside Africa, expect none at all. This became a load-bearing baseline rather than a rough estimate anyone expected to revisit, the number every other population's Neanderthal percentage got measured against for years. Ask a genetics student in almost any given year of that decade what an African genome should show, and 0 Neanderthal ancestry was the answer they'd been taught to give without hesitation. The same way they'd answer a question about blood type or eye color. Nobody was lying to anyone. Picture a detective working a case with half the city's fingerprint records missing from the file. The evidence in hand pointed one direction and pointed there consistently, right up until someone finally built a tool sharp enough to check the other half of the file, the part nobody had ever properly opened. That baseline only existed in the first place because of one of the biggest genetic surprises of the last 20 years. For a long time, modern humans and Neanderthals were treated as two branches that split apart deep in the past and simply never mixed again. Full stop, end of story. Then researchers managed to sequence a Neanderthal genome well enough to compare it directly against the genomes of people alive today. And they found a repeatable trace of Neanderthal ancestry sitting inside the DNA of anyone whose family history runs outside Africa. On average, that trace works out to somewhere around 1.5% to 2% of a person's total genome, a small slice but a measurable one, showing up again and again across unrelated individuals. It became one of the most quoted numbers in modern genetics, repeated in classrooms, documentaries, and casual dinner table conversations about ancestry test results for years afterward, always with the same quiet asterisk attached. This applies to Europeans, to East Asians, to almost everyone whose ancestors happened to leave Africa at some point. African populations were treated as the built-in control group in that comparison, the one place on the map where that signal was supposed to sit at a flat 0, no matter how the rest of the number moved around. Textbooks rarely explained why the control group should behave differently from everyone else. It was simply inherited as a given, passed from one edition to the next without a fresh look. Imagine finding out 20 years into a friendship, that a story you both accepted as background fact turned out to rest on nobody actually having checked it. That's roughly what was about to happen to an entire branch of science on a global scale, and almost none of the people teaching the zero rule had any reason to suspect it. For years, that asterisk held up surprisingly well under scrutiny, but underneath it, the story was never quite as tidy as the classroom version made it sound to a general audience. A handful of researchers, working with older statistical tools years before the 2020 study came along, had already picked up faint, inconsistent traces of something archaic-looking buried inside African genomes. Nobody built a career on it or shouted about it. The traces were noted, then set aside. The problem was that the signal stayed too weak and too noisy to confidently call it Neanderthal ancestry rather than ordinary statistical noise creeping into the data. Here is the deeper issue underneath that uncertainty. The tools available at the time were built around one specific kind of comparison. They looked at an African genome sitting next to a non-African genome and measured the difference between the two. If the very thing researchers were hunting for happened to be sitting without fanfare inside both sides of that comparison at once, the method could miss it, no matter how carefully anyone ran the numbers afterward. Earlier scientists weren't careless. Their instruments simply weren't built to see this particular shape of evidence, and nobody had reason yet to build a different one. That blind spot sat there for over a decade, filed away as background noise instead of the clue it turned out to be, cited occasionally in passing, but never chased down. No one was hiding it. It simply sat unexamined, the way an old assumption tends to sit once enough people have repeated it with confidence, like a locked door nobody had tried turning the handle on in years. If a single missing fossil record and a decade-old blind spot in the method can hold up a rule this long without anyone seriously challenging it, hit subscribe now, because the next part of this video is exactly where that door finally swings open. In 2020, a research team based at Princeton, led by geneticist Lu Chin and working inside Joshua Akey's lab, decided the old comparison method simply was not good enough to trust anymore. So they built a new one entirely from scratch, called IBDmix, specifically designed so it would not need an outside, supposedly Neanderthal-free population to measure against in the first place. Instead of comparing two genomes against each other and hunting for a difference between them, it could scan a single genome directly, hunting for long, unusually intact stretches of DNA that matched known Neanderthal sequence, no matter which population that genome originally came from. That distinction matters more than it sounds. The older approach could only describe a difference between two groups. It could never point at one genome and identify a specific stretch as Neanderthal on its own. IBDmix could. They pointed this new method at a large set of public African genome datasets that had never been tested this specific way before. Datasets that had simply been assumed clean for a decade and never seriously rechecked. The result went well beyond a small, marginal correction, the kind of footnote update nobody outside the field would ever notice. Every African population included in the study came back carrying a measurable Neanderthal signal, spread broadly across the group rather than concentrated in a handful of unusual individuals or one outlier population. Whatever the team expected walking into that analysis, it wasn't a clean sweep across every population they checked, and there's no polite way to undersell a result like that once the numbers are sitting in front of you. The number that had anchored a decade of teaching simply wasn't there once someone finally built a method capable of properly looking for it. That's a full decade of lecture slides needing an update, and Princeton's team is the one that forced it. The team published the finding in the journal Cell, and without much fanfare, it rewrote a line in the textbook that almost nobody outside professional genetics had ever thought to seriously question in the first place. Among geneticists, the reaction was less shock than recognition. A gap people had half noticed for years finally had an explanation attached to it. Almost nobody outside the field heard about any of it, which is why a fact this well-established inside genetics can still surprise a general audience today. Part of that is simple math. A correction to a specialist method rarely makes it into a headline, even when the correction changes what zero meant for an entire continent. It's the kind of finding that would lead the evening news if it touched almost any other subject, and instead it sat inside one journal article, adjusting a fact nobody thought was still up for debate. So where did that Neanderthal DNA come from, if Neanderthals themselves never set foot on African soil at any point? The leading explanation offered in the paper isn't that Africans and Neanderthals met face to face. At some point, history simply forgot to record. It's migration, and it runs in the opposite direction from the one most people naturally picture when they hear the phrase Neanderthal ancestry. Long after early modern humans first left Africa and picked up Neanderthal ancestry while living alongside actual Neanderthals in Europe and Asia, some of their descendants eventually moved back into Africa generations later, carrying that inherited Neanderthal DNA along with them the whole way home. Over many generations, through fully ordinary population mixing, that inherited signal spread outward into African populations that had never personally left the continent at all. The paper's own authors treat this back migration as the primary driver behind what they found sitting in the data. It's worth being honest here that this is presented as the leading, best-supported explanation rather than a single, fully closed, unanimous case, the way it sometimes gets flattened in a headline online. And this is genuinely where scientists start disagreeing with each other, not just with the old textbook. A smaller amount of active debate remains among researchers over exactly how much of the total signal back migration alone explains, versus other smaller, harder-to-trace pathways layered underneath it, and over exactly how many separate waves of movement were involved rather than one clean, single event. Some researchers lean toward a steady trickle of people moving back into Africa over a long stretch of time. Others think the bulk of it arrived in a smaller number of larger movements, with the trickle filling in the edges. Nobody currently has the kind of airtight evidence that would settle it outright, and that's not a weakness in the story, it's just what an active, unresolved argument inside real science actually looks like while it's still happening. Either way, the core mechanism on the table is migration into Africa, not any direct contact happening inside it, which is exactly the possibility the old zero assumption never left any room for at all, because the old assumption was only ever built to test for contact, not for a returning population carrying the evidence in with them. So here's the honest, still open question at the center of this whole video. If you had to bet on steady trickle versus a few big waves, which side would you take and why? Drop your answer in the comments, because this is the one part of the story even the people who wrote the paper haven't fully settled. Once researchers stopped assuming Africa was automatically supposed to read zero, the rest of the global map got a lot more interesting too, not just more accurate on one continent. Picture that map not as one flat color washed over every continent outside Africa, but as a set of overlapping tides that rolled in at different heights in different places, then never fully drained back out. Outside Africa, it turns out Neanderthal ancestry isn't evenly spread around the planet either, the way a single flat percentage might suggest to a casual viewer. Estimates drawn from this same body of research put European genomes at somewhere around 51 megabases worth of Neanderthal-derived DNA on average, a measurable chunk of the genome rather than a rounding error. East Asian genomes come out close behind at somewhere around 55, which is a noticeably narrower gap between the two groups than a lot of older, more casual coverage tended to imply when this topic came up in general conversation. And the population carrying the single highest total amount of archaic ancestry anywhere on Earth isn't European or East Asian at all, which surprises almost everyone hearing it for the first time. Populations across Melanesia and Papua New Guinea carry the highest combined Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry of any group studied so far, a legacy left behind by a separate, older wave of interbreeding with an entirely different archaic human population that most people have never even heard of outside a genetics classroom. Put a pin in all of it, and the practical upshot is this. How much Neanderthal DNA does a population carry was never a simple two-answer question. One number for Africa and one number for everywhere else. It's a gradient shaped by who moved where and when, layered on top of each other over tens of thousands of years. None of these numbers are small rounding errors buried in a footnote somewhere. They're the actual shape of a much messier, much more interesting story than a simple outside Africa versus inside Africa rule was ever built to capture in the first place. And the more closely anyone looks, the less that old flat rule holds up under real data. For anyone comparing ancestry test results with friends or family, that's the actual reason two people from different continents can land on such different Neanderthal counts, even though both numbers hold up equally well under scrutiny. It also means the old habit of treating Neanderthal ancestry as a single worldwide percentage was always going to flatten a much richer picture into something simpler than it is, the genetic equivalent of describing every ocean on Earth by its average depth and calling that the whole story. If you've ever pulled up a 23andMe or AncestryDNA report and stared at your own personal Neanderthal variant count, you've already brushed up against this same messy reality without fully realizing it at the time. Those percentile scores only compare you against other people already sitting in that specific company's database. So two people carrying an identical raw Neanderthal count can land on wildly different percentiles, purely depending on who else happened to test with that same company that year. That's a totally different thing from the population level numbers this video has been walking through, which come from careful genome comparisons in published research, not from a shifting customer database. It's a genuinely fun number to screenshot and share with friends, but it's a comparison against a moving pool of strangers, not a clean, absolute measurement of your personal ancestry sitting entirely on its own. Send your percentile to the one friend who's already tested and see whose is higher. You'll probably both be surprised, and neither of you is wrong because you're not actually being measured against each other. Somebody on that exact same continent as you almost certainly has a very different number, and that gap between two neighbors on the same landmass is really the entire point of everything covered in this video. It's a small personal echo of the exact same lesson the 2020 study taught the entire field. A single number, taken as gospel without checking who and what it was measured against, can silently hide a much messier and more interesting reality underneath it. The lesson scales from one person's phone screen all the way up to an entire continent's genetic history, and it's the same lesson both times. Put every piece of this together, and the old zero story was never really about Africa having no genuine connection to Neanderthals at all. It was about a measurement method that could only see connections arriving from one single direction and went blind the moment the signal doubled back the other way instead of arriving the way everyone expected. Fix the underlying method, point it the right way for the first time in over a decade, and a population assumed to have nothing carries a measurable piece of a species that vanished tens of thousands of years ago, delivered home by its own distant descendants without anyone noticing for a decade. That's a more honest version of this story than either extreme on offer. Somewhere between Neanderthals secretly lived in Africa too, and Africa stayed untouched by any of this. Something tangled and secondhand sits in between, moving back and forth across a continent over thousands of years, which is roughly how most of human ancestry looks once anyone bothers to go looking properly instead of trusting a shortcut built on one missing fossil. 10 years of classroom shorthand collapsed into a single corrected line, and the map underneath it got both more complicated and more accurate at the same time. That's usually how real corrections work in any field worth paying attention to. Not a scandal, not a cover-up, just a better instrument finally pointed at a question everyone had stopped thinking to ask twice. If this rewired how you picture that map, share it with the one person you know who still insists Neanderthal DNA simply stops dead at a border on a map, because the actual border, it turns out, was never in the DNA at all. It was in the method built to measure it. And once that method finally got fixed, the border simply stopped showing up on the map at all. For good.